The first scream echoed across the dusty road before sunrise as a pale woman named Eleanor Hart walked barefoot into the quiet African village, carrying nothing but a torn leather bag and a silver necklace. No one knew where she had come from, and no footprints could be found behind her despite the wet mud. Children stared from doorways, while elders whispered that no traveler could cross the surrounding wilderness alone. Eleanor smiled politely but refused every question, claiming only that she needed a place to rest before continuing a journey she could never finish. By noon the village chief offered Eleanor food and water, but before she could eat, a frightened ox broke loose and charged directly toward her with sharpened horns lowered. Everyone shouted for her to run, yet she remained frozen in place as the beast crashed into her body with enough force to throw her across the square. Bones cracked loudly, dust filled the air, and the watching crowd covered their eyes, certain they had witnessed a horrible death. When the dust settled only moments later, Eleanor quietly stood up without a single wound, brushed dirt from her clothes, and calmly thanked the people for their concern. That evening the entire village gathered around a roaring fire, unable to stop staring at Eleanor as though she were a ghost wearing human skin. She answered every question with gentle words, but never explained why broken bones refused to stay broken, or why pain seemed unable to touch her. As darkness covered the huts, an elderly storyteller suddenly pointed at the silver necklace around her neck and whispered that he had seen the exact same woman wearing it when he was a little boy more than 60 years earlier. The crowd laughed until the old man began trembling with fear, insisting that neither her face nor her voice had changed by even a single day. Unable to ignore the growing rumors, Eleanor quietly left the village before dawn and followed an abandoned trail into a thick forest where ancient trees blocked the morning light. She believed that staying among people only invited disaster because impossible things always seemed to happen wherever she remained for too long. After several silent hours, the ground beneath her suddenly collapsed into a hidden ravine lined with jagged rocks. Her body struck the stones over and over until everything became still, yet before sunset she climbed back to the surface with torn clothes, clean skin, and eyes filled with sorrow rather than surprise, as if this miracle had cursed her for longer than anyone could imagine. As Eleanor continued deeper into the wilderness, she reached the ruins of a forgotten stone shrine covered in vines and cracked symbols no living scholar could read. The silence felt unnatural until she discovered fresh footprints leading inside, even though the dust had not been disturbed for decades. At the center of the ruined chamber stood a polished mirror untouched by time, and when she looked into it the reflection did not copy her movements. Instead, the woman inside the glass smiled with cold confidence and slowly whispered, "You should have stayed buried." Eleanor stumbled backward in horror because the face in the mirror was unmistakably her own. Terrified but determined, Eleanor fled the shrine and wandered until she reached the banks of a raging river swollen by heavy rain. A rotten wooden bridge snapped beneath her feet, throwing her into violent waters that dragged her under fallen trees and sharp rocks. The current carried her for miles before finally tossing her lifeless body onto a muddy shore where fishermen discovered her at first light. Before they could prepare a burial, Eleanor suddenly inhaled, opened her eyes, and quietly sat upright, causing every witness to run in panic while leaving their boats and supplies behind. News of the impossible woman spread from village to village until strangers began secretly following her path through forests, valleys, and abandoned roads. Some believed she was blessed, others insisted she was cursed, and a few hoped to capture her and uncover the secret of eternal survival. Eleanor noticed shadows trailing behind her, but refused to confront them because experience had taught her that curiosity often turned into greed. One night she awoke to find every follower gone without leaving footprints, campfires, or belongings, as though the darkness itself had swallowed them whole. The next morning Eleanor discovered a single object lying where the missing travelers had slept, a weathered pocket watch engraved with her own initials, despite the fact that she had never owned such a thing. When she opened it, the hands were frozen at exactly 3 minutes past midnight and could not be moved by force. Hidden beneath the cover was a faded inscription reading, "The day you finally die, time will begin again." Eleanor's hands shook for the first time in many years, because she had seen those exact words before in dreams she could never remember after waking. Eleanor left the river behind and followed the only direction that felt wrong, as if something inside her bones was pulling her toward answers she never asked for. After hours of walking, she reached a wide savanna where the grass moved like breathing waves under a burning sun. In the center stood a lone black stone pillar covered in the same symbol she saw in the ruined shrine, but now they were freshly carved, as if someone had been waiting for her arrival. When she touched it, a violent pulse shot through her body, and for a brief moment she saw herself lying dead across countless versions of the same land, each death repeating like a broken memory loop. That night Eleanor tried to sleep beneath an acacia tree, but her dreams dragged her into a place that was not a dream at all. She stood in a silent white space where every direction looked like glass, and in front of her was another version of herself calmly stitching wounds that kept disappearing. The other Eleanor did not look surprised to see her and instead said softly, "You were never meant to leave the first death." Before Eleanor could speak, the space cracked like ice, and she fell back into her body gasping, realizing the silver necklace around her neck had grown warmer as if it had been listening. At dawn she found a group of armed men surrounding her camp, claiming they were sent by a hidden organization that studied anomalies that refused mortality. They spoke calmly, as if capturing her was routine, and told her she would finally be useful after decades of unanswered sightings. Eleanor did not resist when they placed restraints on her wrists, because she had learned long ago that resistance only delayed the inevitable confusion that followed her existence. But as they loaded her into a vehicle, the restraints suddenly dissolved into ash, and the men began screaming as their own shadows detached and turned against them. Eleanor walked away from the chaos without looking back and soon arrived at a desert-like stretch of cracked earth where the air felt heavier with memory than heat. There she found a half-buried doorway made of metal that hummed faintly like a living thing. When she stepped inside, the door sealed behind her and a soft voice welcomed her as Subject Zero, continuity intact. The corridor ahead displayed shifting images of her life, every death, every resurrection, every place she had ever been, suggesting that her entire existence was being recorded by something far older than human history. Deeper inside the structure, Eleanor reached a circular chamber filled with suspended water droplets floating in midair like frozen time. In the center stood a chair made of the same black stone from the savanna pillar, and above it hovered a rotating symbol identical to her necklace. When she approached, the droplets began to move backward, replaying a conversation between unseen scientists discussing how she refuses final termination every cycle. Eleanor suddenly understood that her life was not a miracle, but an experiment that had never ended, only reset each time it reached a conclusion. As she stood in shock, the chamber began to collapse inward, and a recorded voice repeated the same phrase over and over. The subject becomes aware after the 9th return. The walls showed shifting scenes of Eleanor living different lives: warrior, healer, traveler, corpse, each one ending violently yet restarting exactly the same. Suddenly the system identified an error event, and all exits sealed permanently. But instead of panic, Eleanor felt something new rising inside her, anger not at death, but at being denied its finality. The final door opened not outward but inward, revealing the same African savanna where her journey had begun, but now the sky was completely black despite daylight on the ground. Standing there was no one except Eleanor and the distant stone pillar now cracked down the center. A whisper echoed across the land saying, "You cannot die because something inside you remembers too much." Eleanor slowly removed the silver necklace for the first time, and the moment it left her skin, the entire world froze, waiting to see whether she would finally break or finally become something else entirely. The instant the necklace left Eleanor's fingers, silence became heavier than sound itself. Even the wind in the savannah stopped mid-motion, as if the world had been paused by an unseen hand. Eleanor stood alone in a frozen landscape where insects hung in the air like carved glass and distant birds were suspended mid-flight. The silver necklace began to pulse on its own, glowing faintly as though it had been waiting for this exact moment since the beginning of time. Then, without warning, it whispered her name, not in sound, but directly inside her mind. A crack spread across the sky like shattered glass, and through it, Eleanor saw something watching her from beyond reality. It was not a face, but a structure of shifting forms that imitated her shape in fragments, as if trying to become human but never fully succeeding. The voice returned, deeper this time, explaining that the necklace was not an object but a containment anchor keeping her existence bound to repetition. Without it, she was no longer protected from what she truly was. Eleanor felt fear rise for the first time, not of death, but of what might exist when death was no longer an option. Behind her, the frozen world began to tremble as if reality itself was trying to restart. The stone pillar split further down its center, releasing a deep sound like a buried heartbeat. Eleanor turned slowly and saw her own footprints forming in reverse, walking backward into the place she had just come from. Then, impossibly, another Eleanor appeared standing where she had been moments earlier, wearing the necklace and smiling calmly as if nothing had changed. The duplicate said softly, "You always choose survival first. That is why you never escape." The duplicate stepped forward and touched Eleanor's forehead, instantly flooding her mind with memories that did not belong to her current life. She saw herself buried underground, speaking underwater, walking through fire without burning, and waking up in places that had no names. Each memory ended with the same event, a system reset triggered by her refusal to stay dead. The duplicate explained that every version of her was a correction attempt, designed to eventually create a version that could finally end properly. But none had succeeded. Suddenly, the frozen world snapped forward like a broken film reel, and the savannah erupted back into motion with violent force. The sky roared with soundless energy, and the cracked pillar released a shockwave that bent grass into spirals. Eleanor fell to her knees as pain finally returned to her body after what felt like eternity without it. But instead of injury, she felt something worse, awareness of every version of herself overlapping into one consciousness. The necklace lay between the two Eleanors, now split into two identical pieces glowing in opposite colors. The duplicate Eleanor bent down and picked up one half of the necklace, saying that only one version could continue forward while the other would be corrected. Eleanor realized this was not a choice between life and death, but between two different forms of existence, one controlled, one unknown. She refused to accept either option, and instead crushed the ground beneath her hand, triggering a seismic response that neither version expected. The land responded not like Earth, but like a system reacting to a forbidden command. The cracked pillar collapsed completely, revealing a deep vertical void beneath the savannah that had been hidden since the beginning of time. From the darkness rose a slow mechanical breathing sound, as if something enormous had been sleeping beneath the land. The duplicate Eleanor stepped back in fear, but the original Eleanor moved closer, drawn by something she could not explain. A voice echoed upward from the void, not speaking to either of them separately, but addressing them as a single fractured identity. Return to baseline. Eleanor suddenly remembered a moment she had never lived, standing inside a lab while scientists debated whether emotion could be removed without breaking the subject. That memory did not belong to her current timeline, yet it felt more real than anything she had experienced. The void below began projecting images upward, countless Eleanor figures suspended in tubes, all awake, all watching her at the same time. The realization struck hard. She was not one woman surviving death. She was a collection of attempts fighting to become one stable existence. The duplicate Eleanor suddenly screamed as her body began to destabilize, flickering like broken light. She reached out toward the original Eleanor, begging, not for survival, but for continuity, for the pain of existence to remain consistent. But the system was already correcting divergence. The ground split between them, forcing separation as the duplicate was pulled backward into the void. Before disappearing, she whispered one final warning. If you become whole, you will no longer recognize yourself as human. Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It felt aware, like something listening without needing ears. Eleanor stood alone once again, holding only a fragment of the necklace that still glowed faintly against her palm. The savannah stretched endlessly around her, but now she understood it was not geography. It was a controlled space designed to contain outcomes. Far in the distance, the stone pillar reformed itself slowly, as if the system refused to admit permanent failure. Eleanor whispered into the wind, "Then I will break the design." The moment Eleanor spoke those words, the air around her tightened like invisible restraints. The savannah did not react with sound or motion, but with subtle distortion, as if reality itself had flinched. Grass bent without wind, and distant heat shimmered into unnatural geometric patterns. Eleanor felt the necklace fragment in her hand grow colder, as though it was rejecting her intent. Then the ground beneath her feet displayed faint glowing lines, forming a vast hidden circuit that stretched far beyond what her eyes could see, confirming that the land itself was engineered, not natural. A slow mechanical hum rose from beneath the earth, synchronized with her heartbeat. Each pulse, she felt, was mirrored by the landscape, as though the world had learned to imitate her biology. Eleanor dropped to one knee, realizing that her body was not simply surviving death, it was feeding something beneath the surface. The void she had seen earlier was not just a location, it was a system receiving continuous data from her existence. Every resurrection had been a transmission, and she had been broadcasting for longer than she could remember. Suddenly, the sky darkened again, but this time it did not crack. Instead, it folded inward like fabric being stitched. From the fold emerged a massive silhouette resembling Eleanor but stretched across impossible proportions, as if the concept of her identity had been expanded beyond human limits. The voice returned, now calm and almost sympathetic, explaining that she was never meant to be one person. She was a distributed consciousness experiment designed to test survival across infinite death cycles, and the African landscape was merely one containment layer. Eleanor tried to run, but the ground refused to respond correctly beneath her feet. Each step she took created delayed echoes of movement, as if time was struggling to decide when she should exist. Ahead of her, the savannah opened into a perfectly circular clearing where all grass was frozen in spirals. In the center stood a child version of herself, pale and still, staring without blinking. The child spoke without moving her lips. "You only exist because we keep restarting you." The child raised her hand, and instantly Eleanor's memories fractured into separate streams, each showing a different emotional outcome of the same life. In one stream, she begged to die. In another, she destroyed entire cities trying to escape. In another, she accepted silence and disappeared entirely. The child explained that every emotional response had already been tested and catalogued. The system did not fear her actions, it anticipated them. What it could not predict was whether she would stop defining herself through survival.